Well, hello again. We're ready to finish issues on the heart and heart action, which were sort of terminated by our early end to our heart lecture last Monday. What we have to cover in the heart is electrical activity, muscle action that affects pressure and volume relationships in the heart, and regulation of heart activity. And we start with a good anatomical slide right now, showing a heart that's been beautifully prepared with the fat and surrounding membranes removed, showing a posterior view of the great expanse that you see here. Let me get my pointer going. Great expanse of the left ventricle and a little bit of the right ventricle that you can see peeking around the posterior aspect here. And then this junction between the ventricles below and the atria above. The atria covered with these ejection vessels that we named and located last time. It brings up a point about the heart, and that is that these ejection vessels and their operation is very important to cardiovascular efficiency. Here's a normal artery here on the left, showing the open lumen of the artery surrounded by its endothelium, its muscle, and its outer epithelial covering. So in normal circumstances, this has to be a very flexible, very strong, pulsing vessel. In issues, in conditions where fat or lipid has been deposited, a deposit we call plaque, it often occurs between the muscle layer and the endothelium. And its effect is to constrict the opening. So what happens here is a point of high pressure and restricted flow. As this plaque grows and further restricts blood flow, it deprives circulation to a region of the body. If that happens in the wall of the heart, then eventually a section of the heart wall muscle fails, and we have what we call a heart attack. Here are two angiograms. On the left, what you're seeing is an open, normal heart. That color enhancement has been arranged to show you the open blood vessels, the arteries descending the ventricle walls and providing adequate blood flow to all the capillary beds throughout the entire heart wall muscle. Notice that there's very little to the atria above. The atria are basically so thin-walled, not much blood flow is needed to keep them alive. But this normal heart is very healthy. Over here, you have coronary artery disease, where restriction of the arterial blood flow has produced a diminished flow, even way up here at the top of the ventricle, and diminished to almost nothing as you descend to the apex of the heart. So where you see these blue vessels or large blank regions, you have regions where very little blood delivery is occurring, and a heart attack is a very real prospect. Today we're going to talk about the cardiac cycle and how electrical activity and muscular activity combine to provide a recurring heartbeat, which pressurizes the blood and produces blood pressure, blood flow, and the supplies that are necessary from the cardiovascular system. A conducting system of special cells that are special sensitive cells that are cardiac muscle cells will conduct that electrical impulse through the wall of the heart. And because it's electricity flowing through a wire, we do have the ability in an ECG or an EKG to detect that action outside the heart. The conducting system basically displays this characteristic called automaticity. That tells you that the signal for the heartbeat at rest is generated within the heart itself, an example of local control. So the basic heart rhythm and heartbeat is set within the heart. Now, outside the heart, there are a number of factors that will require an adjustment of the heart beat and the pulse rate and the blood delivery amount. And so the brain, the sensory organs, endocrine system will all be able to accelerate the heart rate. But in general, the basic rate is set by this system inside the heart. We're back to the anterior view with the aorta and pulmonary trunk above. We can see a part of the superior vena cava here. And over on this 9 o'clock aspect is the right atrium. Drawn as if we have X-ray vision is this collection of specialized cells called the sinoatrial or SA node. This is the pacemaker for the heartbeat. Radiating internodal pathways, thin strips of these cells, go through the walls of the atria and connect to this centrally located atrioventricular node, which is even larger. The AV bundle descends down the septum of the heart. Now, what you're seeing here in this kind of X-ray vision drawing, this is the right side and this is the left side. And this is showing you that first these bundles run down the middle of the heart to the apex and then up the walls like the staves of an umbrella, really forming a cone of these Purkinje fibers. So that when we send the message, we initiate it here, send it through the internodal pathways quickly. When it reaches the AV node, the presence of larger mass of cells actually delays the electrical impulse, pauses, so the atria can contract, move the blood to the ventricles, and then relax as the ventricles will begin to contract. That ventricular impulse then will move down here and up the walls. The heart will contract from the apex, moving up toward this joining point with the atria. The pacemaker is a function of the cardiac muscle that is absolutely unique. Skeletal muscle can contract and then relax. At night when you're asleep, the skeletal muscle is happy to lock itself in a relaxed position. The cardiac muscles must contract, fill, and contract again. They never stop. And that's because of the presence of certain new gates that allow the change from resting potential to action potential to occur on a recurring or automatic method. So these are autorhythmic. What happens, and we're seeing here the voltage or the potential difference fluctuation that's detected outside the heart. Here is a action potential shown by the dotted line, the so-called threshold, that depolarizes, repolarizes, hyperpolarizes, but then because of these leaky sodium gates, the sodium leaks in quickly and spontaneously depolarizes it back to the action potential to initiate another heartbeat. This is occurring about 80 to 100 times in the sinoatrial node, and so it's called the pacemaker, and it's going to work with this cycle of depolarize, repolarize, hyperpolarize, and depolarize back to action potential on a regular basis because of these new specific ion gates. Looking at some of these effects, autonomic stimulation, parasympathetic stimulation uses the neurotransmitter acetylcholine, and its effect is to slow the rate of the heartbeat. Let's see how that affects. When you have excess acetylcholine released, it allows potassium to leave the cell. That makes the cell more negative. So what effect does that have? Here's a normal heartbeat shown up here above, and with a spacing like this is about 75 beats per minute, a good basic average. Whereas here, we have a heart contraction to that 60 millivolt threshold, and because sodium is leaving the cell under the effects of acetylcholine, it goes further to about minus 70 millivolts. Now at that point, the depolarization, because of the movement of that potassium, is slower, and so coming back to this minus 40 threshold, is going to take a longer time. See how the peaks are stretched out. And therefore, a normal heart rate of 75 beats per minute is slowed to 40 beats per minute because of parasympathetic stimulation, acetylcholine, and potassium movement. Now, conversely, if we go through sympathetic stimulation and release norepinephrine, it's going to speed the heart rate up, because what norepinephrine does is it allows sodium and calcium to move through gates into the cell, making the interior of the cell more positive. So here's the normal heartbeat again, 75 beats a minute. But if you dump norepinephrine into the system, the entry of this sodium and calcium has reduced the repolarization. It's made it more positive. So the time required to reach threshold is reduced. Notice how the peaks move together. This is illustrating a heart rate of about 120 beats per minute that is occurring under sympathetic stimulation and norepinephrine release. So the basic idea here is a normal range of heartbeat. If it's over 100 beats per minute on a sustained basis, that's called tachycardia. And reflecting the role of the pacemaker, they often go into the heart by fiber optic tools. And they can actually visualize, but at the end of the fiber, there's a little tool that basically reaches out and scratches the wall of the right atrium. That often corrects a tachycardia condition. Bradycardia, for an average person, if it's under 60 beats per minute, they usually treat that. But I want to introduce a caveat here. If you have the genetics to be a superb athlete, to operate at the highest levels of competition, and if you condition that body so that it is performing at its maximum efficiency and level of performance, it's not unusual for the heartbeat at rest to drop. So elite athletes often will have a resting heart rate of 50 or 45 when they are at rest. And that is healthy and normal. Although many of these athletes, for example, I knew someone who competed very well at distance running. And he would, if he were sitting and watching a video, or basically in a resting state, and then all of a sudden the doorbell rang or a phone rang and he picked up to answer it, that quick change of activity often would make him feel a little lightheaded temporarily. Now, the idea with the pump is what? Let's contract all the pumping muscles together. So atria all together to charge the ventricles. Ventricles all together to mobilize the blood. And then everybody rests while we fill. That synchrony is important. Pump and fill. Pump and fill. Contract and rest. If we have them working together, we have good, effective, and efficient heart action. If they start to operate on different rhythms, we call these ectopic foci, the different regions of the heart wall that are contracting on different paces. They reduce the efficiency of the heart. So originally that may appear as something like you feel your heart skip a beat or add an extra beat when there's an abnormality to the heart, but sometimes you'll feel that. But more often these different regions of the heart work against each other, and when they're doing that, the efficiency of blood movement is reduced. If it becomes enough of an inefficient heartbeat, then fibrillation can occur. And fibrillation is kind of like cramping or like shivering. You know, we use the biceps brachii to flex our elbow by contracting all of these together and relaxing the triceps. That's how we flex the elbow. Under cold conditions, this bicep might start to shiver to generate heat. And that's taking the different motor units and contracting them not together, but out of sync. And so that's what produces that shaking motion and no movement. of the elbow. Now, when the heart goes into fibrillation, it's sort of like that. The muscles are contracting and relaxing, but out of sync, and so they're not really pumping any blood. Looking at this cycle, the electrical activity, we have to remember from skeletal muscle, there's the electrical impulse, and then there's a slight delay. While those gates open and ions rush across, and as depolarization moves along the membrane, that slight delay before the contraction of the muscle actually starts. And that's an important feature in timing the heartbeat. This 5-step process shows the sinoatrial node here firing in picture 1 and spreading out through those internodal pathways through the right and left side very quickly. And after about 100 millisecond delay, atrial contraction begins. Now, at that point, we're shoving blood into the ventricle, but the electrical activity is continuing to move. It reaches that AV bundle, and that AV bundle delays it slightly, giving the atria time to contract and fill the ventricles, then moves down the septum and up through the Purkinje fibers, stimulating a slightly delayed contraction from the apex of the heart here that rolls the apex of the heart up toward the atrioventricular valves. So that spreads on basically a ventricular contraction basis, sort of like rolling the base of a tube of toothpaste up or squeezing from the bottom, lifting the apex of the heart toward the base above. When we place electrodes on the outside of the body while this is going on, those electrical pulses moving through wire generate moving magnetic fields. And we can detect that. That produces a tracing on paper called an electrocardiogram shown here. The one heartbeat goes from any position to the same position in the next cycle. And we're going to start right here where the pointer is showing us the beginning of the sinoatrial node depolarization. Now that produces a wave of electrical energy that we detect outside as magnetic pulse called the P wave. This is the depolarization of the whole atrium. Now, I want to point out that this is the electrical activity only. This is not the muscular contraction itself. From this point, the muscular contraction will undergo a slight delay and follow along. Now, at this point, Q, that's where atrial contraction is at an end, and atrial repolarization begins. But at that same time, ventricular contraction or depolarization begins. So those two waves, the repolarization of the atria and the depolarization of the ventricles, occur at the same time. So they lie over one another, and you only see one kind of summed peak. This is called the QRS, and it's bigger because it's moving very quickly through the ventricle walls, and there's so much material, so much electricity moving that it produces a larger magnetic pulse. Now there's a period after that depolarization and repolarization where ions are moving, and then here's the T wave, which is when the heart muscle is, the conducting system is repolarizing the ventricles. So this, from the beginning of P to the end of the T interval, this is the active electrical stimulation and muscular movement of the heart. Starting here with T, you have a long period of electrical inactivity as things are repolarizing and approaching threshold before the beginning of the next heartbeat cycle. We can use the electrocardiogram in several ways to detect what exactly is going on in the heart. So what we're seeing here is a kind of a double P wave here, that premature atrial contraction. Often this does not produce anything. You may not even feel it. However, If it's a more dramatic atrial contraction and recurs on a fast rate, it can actually stimulate the ventricle to contract and produce this kind of tachycardia called paroxysmal atrial tachycardia. Atrial fibrillation is shown here. You can see there's no clear pattern in the atria of contract and rest, contract and rest. There's just this waving line. However, atrial fibrillation may not be that serious. It's common in older people. And atrial fibrillation, if it's accompanied by well-spaced and effective ventricular contractions, might express itself as a loss of vigor. You might feel more tired or be able to do less in terms of exercise. But as long as you're moving this blood with ventricle contractions, you might not feel anything else. Premature ventricular contractions becomes a more serious issue because the ventricles are supplying the main motivating force to fill the lungs for oxygenation and to drive blood to the rest of the body. Here's a single event shown here, premature contraction. Here's a repeated event, ventricular tachycardia, which must be treated in order to slow the heart rate. An ultimate expression here, ventricular fibrillation. Notice there is no clear alternating pattern of stimulation and rest, which can set up a muscular contraction and then a resting filling cycle. So as a result, no blood is being moved here, and this would make the heart begin to quiver, and basically blood flow stops. There are differences in the heart muscle. Let's compare them. Here, the skeletal muscle shows what we saw with depolarization from the initial arrival of the nerve stimulation at the neuromuscular junction and rapid repolarization. There was hyperpolarization, and it produces these blue and pink bands, which we called the absolute refractory period, the blue, and the relative refractory period. During the blue period, the ions have shifted sides and you cannot stimulate that muscle packet to twitch again. The absolute refractory period, you've moved things enough. You've recovered some of the basic relationships where the ions should be at rest, and you can stimulate them to contract again. The bottom graph shows on the same time scale how the contraction follows. Notice that it is still building tension in this muscle packet as it comes out of the absolute refractory period. So from the pointer on, you could stimulate this muscle unit to twitch again. So this is where you get those patterns that get away from trepping to active summation or incomplete tetanus during heavy exertion. That's what the skeletal muscle can do. But you'll also notice the skeletal muscle can rest. Over here in the cardiac muscle, there's a different effect. Notice this rapid depolarization and then a long plateau where the inside of the muscle cell stays positive before declining. That produces a very long absolute refractory period. You cannot stimulate this to twitch again. It shortens this relative refractory period before returning down here to its original intermediate potential. Now, after a slight delay, the contraction follows. Notice the contraction is building tension, but as it starts back down, it starts to relax. There is, it's still in the absolute refractory period. And most of its recovery and relaxation is in the relative refractory period. So it's not going to contract again. By the time it reaches a state where it could twitch again, you've returned the ions to their original state. So this delay produces the rhythmic contraction that you need in a pump. Let's take a look at why. The rapid depolarization is from sodium entry. We've seen this before. It's very rapid, not much different there. It ends when those voltage-gated fast sodium channels close. This plateau is caused by a new gate. Calcium gate opens and calcium enters the cell for an extended period of time. When those close, and it maintains this positive charge, this plateau, and this extended absolute refractory period, so that it's not going to stimulate to another twinge. This is giving the muscle then time to contract and move the blood. As we reach this region, potassium is lost from the cell, making it more negative, and a relative refractory period ensues. So it's basically 250 milliseconds before you get to a point where you can stimulate the muscle to contract again. So that's a very different situation and produces the delay you need in a pump. Now, we've talked about the anatomy of the heart, the construction of its tissues, its histology. We've talked about the electrical activity in ECG or EKG activity. Now, we're going to put those together into a study of the cardiac cycle because the ultimate aim of the heart is to move blood. The cardiac cycle is the period of one heartbeat, and it's distinguished by contraction phases, which are called systole, and relaxation phases, which are called diastole. Now, we typically use these terms when we express blood pressures. The systolic pressure is the maximum pressure that's achieved in basically a large artery that's outside the heart. So 120 millimeters of mercury is a typical at-rest systolic pressure. When the heart relaxes, the diastolic pressure, the pressure in the vessel starts to drop. The minimum that is reached before the next contraction cycle is called the diastolic pressure. 80 millimeters is a typical diastolic pressure. So blood pressure 120 over 80 or 110 over 80 are often typical. So as I said, this is a pump. We're alternating contraction and blood ejection with relaxation and heart filling. We are directing the flow by valves. So if you actually just move a chamber back and forth, then water can move back and forth. But valves closing prevent the backflow until we recover the state where we can pump it in the forward direction again. Let's see how that happens. Now, this is a typical cardiac cycle, and this drawing is a cycle because it's happening again and again. Notice this start point with the black line as atrial systole begins. Now, you'll notice atrial systole is diagrammed here, and the bundle around it is ventricular pressure, and you'll notice that that is the end of ventricular diastole. So at this stage, the filling of the atria, the ventricles are still relaxed. When the atria and ventricles are filled based on the back pressure and the atria contract, it pushes that extra blood, tops off the ventricles, if you will. About 20% of the blood load in the ventricle is produced by this atrial contraction, and it's all happening at pretty low pressure because the ventricles are still relaxed. But at this line, a tenth of a second, 100 milliseconds from the start, the ventricles begin to contract. Now, the atria are relaxed above them, so there would be nothing to prevent backflow if these valves did not slam shut from the blood pushing up against them. The atrioventricular valves close, and the semilunar valves are still closed. Now, atrial systole ends, atrial diastole begins. Now, ventricular systole begins, and the pressure is starting near zero. Whereas the pressure in these ejection vessels, the aorta, which is where the pointer is right now, and the pulmonary trunk are recovering from that 120 millimeter pressure surge from the last ventricular systole. It might still be 90 or 85 millimeters. So there's a period of time we slam these closed. There's not enough pressure to open these valves. So as the pressure climbs in the ventricles, there's a period of no volume change. We're just shooting the pressure up. When the pressure gets high enough, it shoots through these valves and ejection begins. And you'll notice ventricular diastole takes a little longer because there's a lot more muscle wall to move and a lot more blood to move. And then at this point, which is listed as 370 milliseconds, not quite half the 0.8 of a second that this cycle is taking, at that point, the ventricle relaxes. Now, blood has been flowing out through these ejection vessels, and when we relax the ventricles, we take that pressure away. This pressure is going to push against the semilunar valves and slam them closed. Now, that separates the pressure in the aorta and in the pulmonary trunk from the ventricles below. So the ventricle pressure can drop because the heart is relaxed, but the ejection vessels remain high and go down very slowly. The atria are already relaxed, and so you can see the entry of blood into the atria above. It flows down through the atrioventricular valves, filling the atria and ventricles together until the stretching of the heart walls on each side, right and left, is getting close to equaling the pressure of this blood that's entering the atria above. At that point, the swelling, the filling slows down, and we prepare for the beginning of the next cardiac cycle when the atria will begin by contracting again. Now, we can follow this in a number of ways. A diagram like this is very helpful by picking places in the heart and showing how pressure up here in this upper graph and volume change. And the volume below here is the left ventricle volume. The pressure in the middle, the red line, is the left ventricle pressure, and you should be able to relate the pressure to the volume in each case. We've also put a pressure sensor in the left atrium, which is supplying the left ventricle, and in the aorta, which is the ejection vessel. So let's start right here at 0. Notice the far left is the end of the filling cycle. And we're going to start right here at time 0. That's the time that the sinoatrial node pulses for atrial depolarization. What is happening, you can see, is that the left atrium has low pressure until we begin that contraction, and you can see the pressure bump up as it pushes blood into the ventricle below it. Now, it would only move if the ventricle pressure is lower than the atrium. You can see what happens with the volume in the ventricle. It sort of is leveling off here, but when the atrium contracts, it pushes that final, what would that be, that final 30 mils of blood into the ventricle to fill it to its absolute maximum. That's what happens during this period here to here, atrial systole. We're filling the ventricle. Volume goes up to the maximum, pressure goes up, and then at the end of the contraction cycle begins to come down again. But now there is at 100 milliseconds, we're going to get the AV bundle firing off. That electrical activity causes the ventricle to contract. Now, what's happening? The ventricle is contracting. Look what's happening to the pressure in the ventricle. It's shooting up. In just a few milliseconds, it's gone from close to 10 millimeters all the way up to this point where it joins the pressure, it exceeds the pressure of the aorta. Now, during that time, all the valves are closed. So this is called isovolumetric contraction. Notice that the volume during that time does not change. But the next thing that happens is right here. When the pressure in the ventricle exceeds that in the aorta, it pushes through the door, and then the ventricle and the aorta climb to maximum pressure. Here is the systolic pressure. Notice this is ventricle systole. The systolic pressure peaks out and starts back down, with the aorta and the ventricle being the same pressure because the valve is open. As you open that valve, the volume with the ejection, the volume in the ventricle drops off rapidly, and then toward the end of the contraction of the muscle, it levels off at this minimum of 50 mils. Notice that we filled it to 130, but because of the way muscle fibers work, they can contract from here to here, not from here to here. So at the end of their contraction, you still have a positive volume in the ventricle. And that's what this flat line here is showing. Now, as the ventricle contraction, and this is the boundary between ventricular systole and ventricular diastole, at that boundary, the contraction actually stops, and the pressure, the muscular contraction that's producing the pressure, basically drops away. The heart begins to expand again. That means the pressure in the ventricle begins to drop like a rock as you stop contracting the muscles. As that happens, the aorta is going to push back on that semilunar valve and close the entry, a re-entry to the ventricle. So the aortic pressure remains high. The aorta bulges with each ventricular contraction and reaches this maximum value. And then as the blood moves away through this period, the muscular artery walls are contracting and maintaining blood pressure. Notice that clear over here, where we're starting the next cardiac cycle, the pressure has only gone down to around 80. Let's go back to the ventricle. We're going to drop that ventricular pressure. If you follow the pointer, look at that pointer. At this point, there's no way blood can move from the atrium to the ventricle because that's against the pressure curve. You have to drop it all the way down here. And you'll notice you have to come down to this point before blood starts moving from the atrium to the ventricle. Notice that right here. This is where the ventricle begins to fill again. At first it fills rapidly. Then as the resistance of that stretching ventricular wall increases, you reach a leveling off point as you approach the beginning of the next cycle. Notice how atrium and ventricle are together with low pressure all the way through this filling cycle as the heart prepares for its next round of pumping. Of course, the positioning of the heart places certain valves and certain lobes or chambers at different positions on the chest. So with a stethoscope, you can actually individually listen to the action of a certain valve. And a cardiologist would be a specialist at this. From this location here, we're listening to the aortic valve. From this position here, we are listening to the pulmonary valve. Down here below, we see the locations close to skeletal elements that allow you to listen individually to the AV valves on the left and right side. Now, this is a specialty, but in fact, what you want is a nice, crisp snap or click kind of sound as the valve opens and closes. If you hear a kind of a extended sound or a kind of a sloppy swish, that can be called a heart murmur, and it indicates an incomplete closure and perhaps a leaky valve. The relationship between the time shown below and these pressure and volume curves, remember this is the left atrium, left ventricle, and aorta, right here where the semilunar valves, right here where the AV valves close, that closure, it's what's produced the first loud heart sound, lup, and over here where the semilunar valves close produces the second heart sound, dup. Now almost everyone can hear these two sounds. These minor sounds, the S3 and S4 sounds, are much more of a specialty. When we are assessing heart function, it's not good enough to just be able to take the pulse. Heart disease is still the #1 killer, and that's because the window of time you have to react to a failed heart or the ceasing of circulation is so short that you actually really need to be able to anticipate a heart failure and correct it. And that's where we get into measures of cardiac output. At rest, the cardiac output would be the heart rate times the stroke volume. The heart rate would be at its slowest, and the stroke volume would be a minimal contraction of the heart wall. Now, from this at-rest state, there are outside factors that come in through our nervous system. We detect a need, or we decide on physical activity that will use autonomic innervation and hormones to accelerate the heart rate, so the pulse rate will go up. When the pulse rate goes up, the pressure goes up, and that causes a change in the filling of each heart chamber. The end diastolic volume, when the pressure goes up, the filling at the end of diastole is greater, but under autonomic innervation, under exercise or alarm like sympathetic stimulation, the heart muscle actually contracts with greater force. So the end systolic volume at the end of ejection is lower. So together, those result in what's called stroke volume. So it's not just that the heart beats faster, it's that each heartbeat moves a greater volume of blood. Autonomic innervation accounts for that heartbeat change. A bundle called the cardiac plexus, with the vagus nerve being the parasympathetic connection. Remember, the vagus nerve was the wanderer. It left the head and neck region and descended all the way into the pelvic region. Along the way, it connects to stimulating the electrical system, the conducting system of the heart. In the medulla oblongata of the brain stem, the place where N10, the cranial nerve 10, connects, we have a cardioacceleratory center, which reacts to sympathetic fight or flight stimulation and increases the heart rate. We also have a cardioinhibitory center, a nucleus of cells in the medulla, that responds to parasympathetic stimulation and slows the heart rate, as you will see. We call this a cardiac reflex, and it's responding to a number of different sensors. We have baroreceptors, which are a very special type of stretch receptor. Rather than being embedded in the structural wall of a tissue like a connective tissue or a muscle, they are responding to fluid pressure. We also have chemoreceptors that will respond to changes in carbon dioxide and oxygen level and key these type of responses. They will adjust cardiac activity largely in the upward direction. Autonomic tone is resulting from the balance between sympathetic and parasympathetic stimulation and the balance of acetylcholine and norepinephrine that is currently acting in our body. There are fine adjustments that come from other systems. Let's take a look at this overall anatomy. Here's the medulla oblongata with its central cardioacceleratory and cardioinhibitory centers. We also see connections from the cranial nerve, the vagus nerve, basically descending through the cardiac plexus to its heart connection. The parasympathetic stimulation, you remember, did not have the chain ganglia. So on the right side, parasympathetic vagus nerve connection runs all the way to the surface of the heart. You see the synapses here. So this is the preganglionic fiber running all the way to the surface of the heart, where the synapses occur, and the postganglionic fibers will then tie into the electrical conducting system. Notice there are connections here to the AV bundle and over here to the atrium on the left side. The sympathetic fibers, you'll notice they came out of the spine to a nearby chain ganglia. This actually occurs in the cervical ganglia that extend up above the connection points. This occurs initially with cervical positioning of those chain ganglia. You can see them basically coming out here, and a short preganglionic fiber to the chain ganglion in the T1 to T4 regions, and then a longer postganglionic fiber descending all the way to the heart and connecting to its conducting system. In general, sympathetic will stimulate the heart rate and increase it. Parasympathetic will decrease it. We get an atrial reflex from venous return. The increasing blood pressure will stretch the right atrium especially, and those stretch receptors will basically increase the level of sympathetic stimulation, producing a further increase of blood pressure. Hormonal effects on the heart can be produced by a number of hormones. Epinephrine and norepinephrine from the kidney, from the adrenal glands mounted on the kidney, have been covered before. Thyroid hormone also has an overall stimulating effect and is part of the sympathetic stimulating picture. A principle, though, of this, as articulated by Frank and Starling, was that the end diastolic volume, the extent of filling, as that filling increases, the stroke volume increases. The amount of blood moved by each contraction will go up. Now, it's important not to overstretch muscle. If you remember, skeletal muscle used to contract and then be stretched back out, contract and stretch back out. And under ultimate exertion, you actually could overstretch that muscle. That's why titin is built into the sarcomere, so that as it moves out and is about to overstretch the titin, the titin comes tight and restricts that overstretching. And that's going to happen in the heart too, to prevent overstretching, because as we call for more and more and more resources, the muscular contraction and the heart rate tend to maximize, but they're restrained by in the filling by the myocardial connective tissue, that net of connective tissue that restricts the expansion of myocardial sarcomeres, the cardiac fibrous skeleton, another connective tissue network, and the pericardial sac itself. It's sort of resisting like a balloon as the heart stretches out and provides an additional restraint on that overexpansion. We talk about different factors in this contraction cycle: preload, contractility, and afterload, that basically refer to the properties of how are we filling the heart, how are we contracting the heart muscle, and how is the blood moving as these processes occur. And they result in this kind of very detailed analysis of stroke volume as expressed by end systolic and end diastolic volume and venous return figures. The particular quantities are not going to be dealt with in this course, but I think it's a reflection of the importance of the heart, importance being translated as, if it fails, how fast does it kill you? With heart disease and heart events being a critical medical event, that we have actually developed very partitioned, very segmented analysis of heart and heart action. So just to summarize the control of cardiac output, we have heart rate control factors that accelerate the heart rate. Autonomic nervous system, parasympathetic will retard it, sympathetic will accelerate it. Circulating hormones like epinephrine, thyroid hormone, norepinephrine, and venous return and stretch receptors all affect this cardiac output. And diastolic volume and systolic volume allows us to look at particular aspect of that filling and contraction cycle to figure out where the heartbeat might be going wrong. And the whole point of the cardiovascular system is that ocean current or pond water job. How do we deliver the supplies, oxygen and nutrients, hormones and other needed metabolites, osmotic balance, electrolytic balance of the body fluids? It's the blood that does that. And how do we remove the wastes like ammonia and carbon dioxide that are being produced on a constant basis just by your normal activity? It is the cardiovascular regulation system that keeps this in balance. The cardiovascular centers are going to regulate the heart and vessels together. We saw in sympathetic stimulation last semester a situation where we had a fight or flight challenge, otherwise you're going to die or you're going to be engaged in a physical contest in the immediate future. And sympathetic stimulation is going to move the blood flow to the heart, the lungs, and the skeletal muscles, and even enhance blood flow to some of the special sensory systems. At that time, it's going to close down flow to digestion, to the urinary system, to the reproductive system. In a fight or flight situation, you kind of don't need those. And so these decisions about where to send the blood are going to be regulated by these cardiovascular systems. Alternatively, several times a day, we go from a fasting state just before lunch to a feeding state where we dump a whole bunch of nutrients into our body. At that point, parasympathetic stimulation steers the blood flow to the wall of our digestive tract to pick up those nutrients and to distribute them around the body. Now, for cardiovascular activity, it's not a zero to maximum type of condition. If you look at ranges of cardiac output shown here, so in this range of, let's say, 17.5 to 30, we have what I'll call a normal range of cardiac output during heavy exercise. So this central region, this kind of sweet spot for the average citizen, would show a maximum movement of 30 liters per minute of blood. Now that's quite a bit of blood pumping. Now, if you have the genetics and the conditioning to achieve higher and higher levels of performance, ending up with this highest level to be obtained by trained athletes that are competing, let's say, on an international level. So these are your varsity athletes in some sports, if they are really rigorous sports, or Olympic level athletes in some sports. And you might achieve a cardiac output of 36 to 37 liters per minute. Now down here, you go out of heavy exercise into this range of comfort with moderate exercise or at rest. But as we descend down through these values for cardiac output, below 10, below 7, down to 5, we would reach a danger zone where blood delivery to living cells is no longer adequate to maintain them in a living state. This is where we often see a blood deprivation issue being long-lasting in some tissues, whereas if we get that blood deprivation in the wall of the heart, we get heart failure and an immediate event that threatens our survival. So cardiac output varies broadly, depending on our metabolic demands and on the conditioning of our body, upon our age, and other factors. So just take a look at this, not only the effects on cardiac output from heart rate and stroke volume, but also the interactions of these various systems, giving us a very fine-tuned and sophisticated ability to regulate our heart rate. So that's the end of chapter 20, our second recorded lecture. on the heart.